Hi, everybody. I'm David Brown from Rolling Stone Magazine, and welcome to the live streaming launch and publication day of a brand new memoir, Scattershot, by our special guest here, Bernie Taupin.
Hello.
I'm sure many of you, myself included, have lived with, known Bernie's songs, know him as a songwriter and lyricist with Elton John for over 5 decades that his work has been part of our lives. He has also he's an artist. He's collaborated with other songwriters. He's lived a fascinating life, and it's all laid out in Scattershot, which I believe is your first ever book, Bernie.
Actually, it's not my first ever book. I did write a book in the early to mid 80s called Cradle of Halos, which was actually just a book about my childhood.
Right.
And that was only published in England, actually, and sold, I think, 3 copies. And that was to my family.
Well, just so people know, you can order signed copies of the book at premiercollectibles.com/scattershot. Bernie and I are going to be talking for about a half hour or so. Then we'll be taking some questions from fans and readers. We already have a whole slew of them, so get ready, Bernie.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
Well, I guess to start with, you've written, of course, so many songs, such a productive career. You wrote the one book about your childhood. This is the first one that goes through your whole life. You're still creative. You're still doing paintings, multimedia art. You're still writing new songs with Elton. What made you at this point in your life, in your career, decide, okay, I want to really tell the whole story, get my side of the things out there?
Well, I mean, with all due respect, I think that's sort of a no-brainer. I mean, you don't write a book at the beginning of your career, certainly because you haven't had one yet. And there's not much sense in writing one sort of halfway through. And I'm 73 years old, so it seems like the perfect time to do it while I'm still capable. But yes, I've still got a lot more to say. But quite honestly, I just felt that it was the right time. And it started with just an exercise in writing. Basically, I'd written a piece for Bazaar magazine that they'd asked me to write, and I really enjoyed doing that. And they basically said, if you ever want to write anything else, please submit it because we'd love to work with you again. But I started writing some prose pieces and some stories from my past, and suddenly I kind of realized that hey, what am I doing here? I guess I'm writing a book. And so I started sort of from there. And finally, my literary agent in New York said, we need to get you a deal on this. So luckily, we got a deal with Hachette. And I started working sort of 2 or 3 hours a day in the morning and in the evening, and probably 2 years. So, but it was so enjoyable, and it was such a great journey.
Right. What were the challenges compared to writing songs are much shorter, and this this is a much more personal exercise?
Well, I think writing songs is kind of personal too, because you put a lot of yourself in it too. But at the same time, there was something just stretching your legs on writing vignettes of your past. And it was never my intention to write a sort of linear A to Z autobiography. I wanted to be, hence the title, Scattershot. I mean, it starts with my childhood, obviously, but after Elton and I sort of get to Los Angeles in 1970, it really sort of takes off. It was almost sort of loading a shotgun and just firing it in the air, and the pieces, wherever the pieces fell, that's what if I felt like writing about that day. So it is very scattershot in theory, and it's geographically all over the place. There are chapters that are solely about France, Australia, Mexico, Barbados. So it travels the world, and I travel with it.
Right. the chapter on New York when you first come here, it's particularly since we're in New York
Yeah,
right now.
yeah, right.
It's such a vivid description of what the city was like in 1970.
Well, I mean, I was terrified by it when I first came here because bear in mind, we just come from California, which was sort of, the Garden of Eden, and it was sunny and it was beautiful. And, all of those things that you think about California in the late 60s. I mean, it really was, as I say in the book, I mean, the late 60s, the early 70s were basically still, the late 60s then. Is that the fire alarm?
I think, yes.
We've got a fire alarm.
We've got a fire alarm. But we're staying put. We're not going anywhere, just so you know.
It's a little disconcerting hearing that in the background. But anyway, so by the time I got to New York, and New York, as you probably know, in there, as everybody, you certainly would know, in the early 70s, it was pretty unhospitable. And I always seemed to be here when it was the winter. So that just added to it. But yeah, it was a little hairy and pretty dangerous. But the thing was, I adjusted to it really well. And I got to the point where I just loved it. And I still love it here. I think New York is probably my favorite city in the world. The fact that you can just walk from one end of it to the other, and you can walk to the boroughs, and it's just a fantastic place. But for me back then, in the early 70s, there was so much, food for thought. I mean, it was incredible. So it was very inspiring. And so once I gathered the ability to transverse it, I mean, it became my favorite city.
We're reminded in this book too of, speaking of that era, how young you were when everything hit. When your song, Elton's first song, big hit, came out, you were 20.
I was 20. Well, I actually wrote your song when I wasn't 17, no, because that was when I first met Elton. So I would have been 18, probably 19 when I wrote your song. And that's funny because you're right. I was, by standards now, all of my peers are quite several years older than me. They're moving into their 80s,
right.
And I'm still relatively young at 73. So at least I've got that to look forward to, right?
And starting then, I mean, you also had this unique perspective in that you were a major part of a team, of a process, and yet you had your own life. You were separate from it all. What perspective did that kind of give you on fame and celebrity and music business and all of that?
Yeah, you have to look at it. I mean, from the perspective of when Elton and I first got together, and before, as he was Reg back then, Reg Dwight. This was before he became Elton John. I mean, he didn't become Elton John till on the probably 69, late 68. So yes, I did develop a life later on, but back then, 67, 68, 69, 70, even into 71, we were pretty joined at the hip, I mean, it really was, as I say, me and him against the world, especially in the late 60s when we were just jobbing songwriters. The independence didn't really come till I came to California in 1970 and realized that, this is where I was supposed to be, right. Or that was where I was supposed to be, being that we're in New York. So, obviously we were growing up and we were growing into our own lives, and Elton the same, but as far as the recognition of fame and how it affected me, I never was aware of it. I really didn't ever kind of stop and either smell the roses or just wonder, is this going to last? I just went with the flow. I never really paid much attention to where our records were on the charts, how many albums we'd sold. I depended on other people to just inform me, and they'd say, "Oh, the album's #1." I'd go, "Oh, great, let's go get a drink," But I didn't think it was a good idea to stop and make calculations about success. I always sort of went with the flow and managed to be able to transverse it, in the correct way.
Yeah, you were part of an elite club in a way of lyricists. You know, full-time.
Yeah, there
lyricists.
weren't many. There weren't
Robert,
many of
Robert
them.
Hunter with the Grateful Dead, and
Right.
Keith Reed with Procol Harum. There were a very select group of you. It was like a full-time job back then, which is a fascinating thing to think about.
It's very funny because the thing is that, again, you're right. I mean, there weren't. I think there was the guy. What was his name? Pete Brown, that
Pete
wrote
Brown from
lyrics for
Cream.
Cream,
That's
right?
Mhm.
And we were all mining the same. Not so much Robert Hunter, because he was here and he was on a different kind of level completely. But back then, I think there was a guy called, was it Pete Sinfield, who wrote for King Crimson, right?
That's right.
So there was Pete Sinfield, there was Keith Reed, there was Pete Brown. So I guess there were a few people that were solely doing lyrics, but I always think about that whole story about how Ray Williams, when Elton came in to not rehearse, but try out for Uni Records, when they put that, not Uni Records, sorry, Liberty Records,
Okay.
you know, the famous ad in the paper. When Elton came in there to do his, shtick for Ray Williams, Ray Williams sort of pulled out my lyrics from a stack of lyrics, apparently. Now, how many people do you think submitted lyrics for that? You know, I'm sure I was the only one. I definitely busted that bubble in the book. I can't imagine that anybody else was sending in sort of envelopes full of lyrics. You know, I'm sure I was the only one. But I'd been to see Ray Williams, and I said, well, this is it, man. This is what I do, and this is all I do. So if you can find some way to make this work, I had sort of fanciful ideas of making it into some weird beat poetry or something like that. I don't know what I thought I was, Allen Ginsberg or who knows. But anyway, kismet. I got lucky, right?
Right. Now the legend has it that
there's a lot of legend.
There's a lot of legend. Oh, there's many legends. You addressed many of them. We'll get to some of those.
Right.
The legend was that, as far as the process, you would write a lyric, you'd give it to Elton, he would sit down at the piano, and boom, 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 a song would emerge. Is that legend true? And
that legend is true, and it's still true. It's still true today. Right. Yeah. Oh, there's no legend involved in that. There's no urban myth there at all. No, it was. I mean, when we first started writing together, the very, very first things we were written together, I think I was still living up in Lincolnshire, in the north of England. And I'd sent a couple of things down, but it was very soon that I came down. And when I first came down to London, I moved in with my aunt in the suburb of Putney. But that didn't last very long. Before long, obviously, Elton and I realized that if we were going to work together, we needed to be in the same space together. So that's when I moved in to his mother's apartment with Elton, and we had, this little old bedroom at the back, with bunk beds and all of our stuff in there. And then it became our tiny little Brill building. I would write during the day, in the bedroom, sitting on the side of the bunk beds, scrawling who knows what. And then I delivered them to him in the front room, and he had a stand-up piano, stand-up piano in there. And that's where we wrote all of those very, very early songs about all the stuff of, I think all of the stuff of the very first album, the Empty Sky album. But even before then, we were, as I said, we were jobbing songwriters. So we were trying to make a living writing for people that we didn't really want to write for, and weren't very good at doing those kind of songs. We wanted to drift into that, Keith Reed, Pete Sinfield, that area. That's where we wanted to be. But we were being forced to sort of write these middle of the road songs for people like Engelbert Humperdinck.
Right.
And when we really wanted to be, Pink Floyd.
It's hard to imagine that.
We certainly dressed like them.
Now, when you would write a lyric, and we're talking back then, even up to now, do you have a feeling of what the musical mood, not a melody, but how you envision your head? And were there times when you would give it to Elton and you'd hear the the demo or the finished record and go, boy, that's not what I envisioned at all for this song. Like, it's so different in a good way.
No, I learned to live with that from very early on. I never really thought about that. I always say that a lot of, I didn't have, back in the early days, I didn't have preconceived melodies in my head. I might now when I work, because I'm much more musically proficient and studio savvy now. I know basically how to write songs. In the early days, I was just flying by the seat of my pants. I didn't really know the construction of songs. So I was too busy thinking about what I was putting down on paper and if it was going to work rather than how it was going to end up. But then gradually things changed, obviously. But, what I write pretty much dictates what kind of song it's going to be. I always say if you write Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, it's not going to be a ballad. And if you write Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, it's not going to be an all-out full tilt rocker,
Right,
so
right.
In some way I did sort of direct the bus on how it would end up melodically, but I can't remember ever sort of hearing his end product and going, oh, I didn't imagine it like, well, I might have said I didn't imagine it like that, but there's nothing that sticks in my craw that I can think, that where I was either upset by how something ended up or it's just I always put full 100% faith in his better judgment. That was his wheelhouse, and he worked far better in it than me getting in there and muddying the waters.
Right. So you mentioned your childhood. Let's one of the themes throughout the book in your life, from your childhood through some of those early songs with Elton, an ongoing Tumbleweed connection, through buying a ranch in the 90s, through some of your multimedia art, which has incorporated like American flags and blues and country iconography. You've been fascinated with the American West and cowboys. And where does that come from, and what still is alluring to you about that? Especially growing up as a kid in England, you're so removed from.
Well, I think that you have to go back again to my childhood when I think it really started with the song content before it did with the literary content about the West. I always wanted to tell stories when I was a kid. I liked telling stories. I liked reading stories. The first things that I loved was, I had a great love for narrative poetry, thanks to my mother and my paternal grandfather. But it was when I loved what was pop rock of the day. Obviously, like any kid, I gravitated to that. But it was really when I started hearing snippets of what I call real country music on the radio. There was country music on the radio, but it wasn't. It was kind of watered down country music. It was sort of the Jim Reeves and the Slim Whitmans and Roger Miller and Eddie Arnold, and that wasn't the kind of country. But when I heard people like Marty Robbins and Johnny Horton and Johnny Cash, when I got to hear some of that, they were telling stories. That was like narrative poetry, Sink the Bismarck, Battle of New Orleans, and then of course, the first album I got hold of that just blew my mind was Marty Robbins' Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs with the immortal El Paso on it. Right. And that just changed everything.
And that great cover with him.
Oh my God. The pink cover with the black outfit on. Right. I'd still play that record today. It's still such a lightning rod in my life. But they were telling stories, and they weren't sanitized cowboy stories like Roy Rogers or the Lone Ranger. They were the real deal. You could smell the dust and smell the sweat, and those they weren't all rhinestones and pearl handle pistols. They were the real deal. And when I heard those, I went, whoa, you can tell stories and you can make them into songs. So that was sort of a huge catalyst. And then I loved I loved American history. I was never interested in English history. I loved the history of the American West, the opening of the West. The characters appeal to my adventurous spirit, if you will, and it all culminated from there. I just went on to learn more about it, and it just took over my life ultimately, and to the point where I ended up doing being the real thing, and cowboying and competing in rodeoing and what have you, for 10 years of my life.
Right.
Cutting, yeah. I mean, I don't know how many people know what cutting is, and it's way too complicated to waste time talking about here, else we'd be using up all our time. But if you're interested, I think I say in the book, I do describe it, but I also say, if you want to learn more about it, go on YouTube and just put cutting, and you'll see what it's all about.
And also the things that jumped out in the book too, when you were talking about your writing, and up until, I didn't realize this, but up until Blue Moves, you kind of avoided getting too personal in some of your words. Yes, hints of it, but you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends how personal you mean. You mean if you're talking about if you're talking about relationships and personal relationships, possibly. But before that, it's interesting when you, I think I address it in the book. I mean, up to a certain point, not many of our songs were about physical relationships, romantic relationships. If you think about it, the Yellow Brick Road album, there isn't one love song on there. It's all about characters.
Right,
and I always much preferred writing about characters that I came into contact with on my travels. I was always observing, and people are just the best food for songs, and I've done that since day one. So writing love songs is okay, but writing happy love songs isn't a lot of fun. They're kind of, it's nice to be positive, but at the same time, it's not that great,
And it did set you and Elton so much apart back then, because there were so many singer-songwriters back, and great ones.
Right, absolutely.
James Taylor Jackson, Carole King, you go on, amazing songwriters who were addressing their ups and downs of their lives. You could listen to an album and you kind of sense of where they were in their lives. And Elton, you weren't really doing that so much, which distinguished you.
Yeah, I didn't want to put me into the songs, because it wouldn't have been fair, And any time I felt about writing things that are situations that have come to fruition in my own life, or if they're personal issues, I've tried to sort of marry them with possibly some of what Elton's experiencing at the same time. So I didn't want to write completely about my own issues ever, because it just wasn't fair. It would be putting my own personal trials into somebody else's mouth, and I was uncomfortable in doing that, and I didn't want to put myself out there. I wanted to write stories about other people. I mean, we got personal later on, talking about ourselves. I mean, the perfect way of doing it was how we did it on Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, because that was an album which was about both of us. So it was easy to write songs about our adventures at that particular point in time. And a very small point in time. I mean, Captain Fantastic is just about the years between 67 and 70, and us finding our way in life. And I mean, it was lovely to be able to revisit that and write about it, and eventually have him sing about it,
and then do it much later with Captain and the Kid all over again.
Exactly. I'm not sure if that was terribly a good idea, but it was something I think that needed to be done. I mean, I think that's somewhat of an unsung album. It was great, but it kind of got buried with some record company politics at the time that weren't very a bit unsavory, and I think that album got sort of lost in the wash a bit, but it's definitely an album worth revisiting. There's some great stuff on there.
Were there other times that you mentioned in the book, All the Nasties, other times when you put yourself in Elton's head? How often did that happen when you were
It
thinking?
didn't happen a lot back then. I mean, again, I was telling stories that really weren't involving either one of our characteristics. They were completely alienated from our own lives. I mean, the lives that we were living were nothing like the characters that were in the song,
Right.
by any means. But I forgot what your original question was.
Well, all the nasties.
Oh yeah,
about,
right.
About
Well,
Elton's
that
fears
was,
of coming out.
yeah.
That's their point, basically.
It wasn't. It was a sort of two-edged sword, that song. I felt it necessary because at that particular point in time in England, the music press had this sort of way of, they were very happy to build you up, and they were equally happy to sort of drag you down once you were up. And then obviously there were rumors rife, about Elton's sexuality, and there were a lot of sort of mean-spirited sort of digs around, and which I didn't understand, because I thought that the British press or music press would be happy for us that we were competing against, because at that particular point, I think outside of maybe Cat Stevens, as he was then, we were the only singer-songwriters coming out of England. I mean, there was this huge wave of singer-songwriters, all the ones that you just mentioned: Carole King, James Taylor, Jackson Browne, Neil Young, dozens of them. I mean, really dozens of them. And I think there were only two really prevalent singer-songwriters in England. That was Elton and Cat Stevens. So I didn't quite understand that they weren't being lauded a bit more for, flying the flag for the UK. Right. So that's the reason I wrote that song.
Okay.
And I just felt, he'd done so much to stand up for me in my early days. I felt I should return the favor.
And you also mentioned some of the lyrics you've written that have been misunderstood, and like "Madman Across the Water." There's a theory that people had about that, which I never heard before.
Oh, you never heard that
one?
No, I thought that was quite well known. No,
I did not.
Well,
it was Richard. People thought it was about Richard Nixon.
Yeah, well, let me preface by the fact that I've always thought that, to quote, I think it's Paul Simon said that, a lot of people come up with ideas for what his songs are about, and some of them are far more interesting than what he originally perceived them to be.
Right.
And I subscribe completely to that. I love when people come up with different ideas for the songs, and I don't really care. I don't care for analyzing our songs and talking about where they came from and why, I wrote this. And I mean, I love the fact that people come up with their own, conceived concepts for what a song's about. Yeah, and Madman Across the Water, which I always thought was pretty clear that it was written about, an institute, and how sometimes the inmates are not, they should be running the asylum, because they're sort of perceived to be crazier than they really are. And it was all about that. And somebody, I don't know, started the rumor that it was about Richard Nixon. And I ultimately looked at it and went, well, because it was at the time of Watergate. And I thought, well, why not? If you want it to be about Richard Nixon, it's fine with me. Run with it,
And I'm Still Standing also is one that...
Yeah, I mean, and again, I've talked about that at length and admitted it in the book. It was sort of a kiss off to a former girlfriend, which now I regret because we're very good friends. But it was, but those things are moments in time that you can't take back. And but after a while, that song became far more associated with Elton's sort of coming out of rehab and, his strong sort of sense of survival. Right. And it's sort of his anthem. And I'd much prefer it be perceived as that rather than what it was originally intended to be, because I kind of somewhat regret that. But at the same time, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't change history. Right. So yeah, it's more anthemic and about Elton.
Now, there are two songs, kind of deep cuts of yours I've always loved, and looking back, they're so prescient, I think. Texan Love Song. from Don't Shoot Me, which is really it's about a sort of a redneck being really not happy with the counterculture.
Right.
And it really,
That was
like,
my Okie from Muskogee.
yeah.
Man.
What like that paints, that's like the country now.
But I love putting myself into other characters' bodies, you know, and talking from their perspective. And I think that's fun to do. I mean, again, it's all part of that thing, as I say, about creating characters from real life. You know, it's like how when the Byrds did Drugstore Truck Driving Man, and it was supposed to be about who was the Emery, the Nashville guy that was the talk show.
Oh, Ralph Emery.
Ralph Emery,
yes,
right?
yes.
You know, that was supposed to be about him. You know, but I had nobody in mind when I did that. Again, it was just a pastiche of. It was my Okie from Muskogee. You know, I love that. I couldn't remember one word of it if you asked me to. Now, I remember it was pretty hardcore.
It was. Well, we're going to shift over to some questions from readers, which we have
okay,
a number of them. Okay. We're going to start with Grant from Smyrna, Georgia.
Okay.
Was there ever a period of time when you didn't want to write songs or thought about going to a different genre?
Well, I don't know if you mean in genre in songwriting, you know, in song. You're actually didn't want to write songs. No, never. No, I mean, there's not much else I can do other than cook and create art. So the good thing is, like, again, like old Duke Ellington said, everybody should do two things. And if you want, you can do three things. So I've always been very comfortable in the genre I'm in because I've been able to do other things at the same time. But I've never, ever, for one moment in my life, considered going, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm tired of it. No, I mean, because there's always more to achieve. There's always something else to say.
That's an amazing thing to say, given it's been 55-ish or so years.
Yeah, I'm still excited about the process of writing songs. You know, I'm looking forward to getting back in the studio once Elton has rested up from the tour and had a vacation. And, you know, I mean, he's only, obviously, people tend to think because he's retiring from the road, he's retiring, period. No, we've still got a lot to say, and we're looking forward to doing it.
Is there another record already?
We're working on it. We've got ideas in the works, but nothing I can really talk about right now.
Okay, next we have Carl from Ambler, Pennsylvania. If you hadn't been a songwriter, what would you be doing now?
I've often thought about this, and I think I would be in some form of creative art. I always fancied advertising. I might have tried my hand at that, you know, coming up with slogans. I think that would have been fun, you know. I don't know what the actual terminology for that job is, but yeah,
copywriter, right? Is it?
I don't know, but I could see. I mean, there's certain logistics about advertising that probably. You know, I wouldn't have liked too much, but it's creative. I certainly would have attempted to do something creative.
Okay.
And that seems like a good way of expressing yourself.
I wouldn't have predicted that answer. That's
okay. Well, what was it Ringo said when they asked him? He was going to have a chain of beauty parlors, wasn't he? Right. Be a shoe salesman, right. Like in Spinal Tap. Yeah. Yes, madam. Here's a fun. Yeah.
Next, we have Brian from Longview, Texas. What is the inspiration behind the song "Burn Down the Mission"? I love the song, but I've always wondered who the protagonist was you thought it would be.
That's a good question. You know, that you have to put yourself back into the shoes of the young man that wrote that, and that's very difficult. I mean, I was trying to write in, and I'm not trying to crawl out of this one, but I was trying to write in the same sort of timeless quality that the band had, you know, on those early albums, where you couldn't really figure out when it was taking place. And I think that could have been something that was part of the Revolutionary War or part of the Civil War. I think it was a blending of different time periods. But most of all, I wanted something to be of a timeless historical quality, very with a sort of patina on it and very sepia toned. But as far as the protagonist, I mean, the protagonist can definitely sort of be whoever you want it to be. It can be an invading force. It could be it's basically just a hostile element, but you're never really sure whether it's a good hostile element or a bad hostile element. Which one is the instigator and which is the protector? So I think again, it's one of those songs that the actual real perception of it is lost in the mists of time, but it's supposed to just have a blend in with the rest of the album. As all that whole album is very much sort of infused with images of the Civil War and the American West. So it works itself into that whole panorama.
It does. And that album has one of my favorite songs, which is "Come Down in Time." It's a beautiful
Right.
as well.
Thank you.
We're going to go to Mackenzie from Seaside, Oregon. The song "I Want Love" gave me the courage to begin my gender transition. What has the LGBTQ community meant to you during your career?
Wow, that's interesting. I'm fascinated by that one. That's I mean, because that song is with all due respect, and I'm humbled by that, absolutely, of course. But that song in particular was written after a particularly sort of unpleasant divorce and a time in my life, and it's very personal to me. Which going back to one of your earlier questions. Mm-hmm. It's basically somebody saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done with it. I'm not going to try to find the good in anything. But at the same time, I think looking at the protagonist in it, you kind of go, you're not really, fully committed on this. It's almost it's almost like trying to push it away, but ultimately you're not going to win by doing so. And I'm happy that somebody, who was that again?
That was Mackenzie.
Mackenzie, I'm happy that helped you. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, and I'm touched by that, of course. And I've always tried to be supportive in every way I can to causes, on all kinds of different levels. So you got my vote.
Now that was an amazing question. Doug from Whiting, New Jersey. Your lyrics are very cinematic. What movies or directors have inspired you?
Oh, that's good. Well, I've always wanted to be, that's one of the things Elton always says about my songs. I mean, my lyrics being very cinematic and they tell stories. And that's exactly what I want to be thought of as. I'm kind of, I think of myself as a cinematographer, taking mini movies of life and transferring them into songs. But as far as directors, I mean, Peckinpah was my idol when I was young. I mean, from the time I saw Ride the High Country all the way up to The Wild Bunch, which I think is probably one of, if not the greatest American movie ever made. Wow. And I have seen it so many times, I could probably recite every line in it from top to bottom, but magnificent because he, while John Ford was the first director, I think, to sort of show the West as it was, Peckinpah really, really brought it home full on, hit a home run by showing it for what it was. And I had a huge respect for that. So Peckinpah, I'm a big Kubrick fan. But yeah, it's I'm glad that people see me in that sort of light as somebody who is making many movies.
No, yeah. Here's a fun one from Lisa from Warner Robins, Georgia. Who decides, I guess regarding you and Elton and others who work with, who decides on the title of a song?
Oh, me, definitely. Yeah, because in fact, is one of the first things that sometimes the first thing that I come up with
Okay.
when you see, what you have to understand now is I don't write on a daily basis. I'm either creating art or doing other things. The only time I write songs now, and I'm sorry, when I say songs, obviously I mean write lyrics. Um, I am if Elton comes to me and says, "Oh, we're going to go into the studio in a couple of months," I want to go in the studio in a couple of months. That's when I'll start writing. Um, and yeah, I like, again, I make notes all the time, but most of the time I will come up with a title first. It's either a title or a sort of first line for a chorus, but that usually involves the title anyway. So I would say 85% of the time I come up with a title first.
Oh, interesting.
So yes, in answer to your question,
you're the man.
I am the man. I am the man.
Has Elton ever said, "I don't like that title"?
I don't think so. Not to my recollection.
Okay.
No.
Next, we have Jack from Burnsville, North Carolina. Can you tell us what the circumstances were when you wrote "Someone Saved My Life Tonight"?
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is, that's from Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, and that's based on after Elton was persuaded from getting married the first time, because we certain parties and friends of his, and certainly myself, and at the time a guy that he'd been working with, Long John Baldry, who was actually the first gay man I ever met, but Elton had been his keyboard player, and Elton was supposed to get married, and we went out prior to the wedding. The wedding was weeks away, but we went out one night, and a very, very drunken night. And Long John Baldry basically said to him, "What are you doing? You're obviously a gay man." And Elton's like, "Well, am I?" And and because he was sort of in the transition period there, he wasn't sure, but he didn't know if he had to sort of toe the line and pay homage to respectability or whatever, very confused basically. And literally Long John Baldry set him straight, well, no, actually,
so to speak.
So to speak. Exactly. Sorry, wrong choice of words. But anyway, so that's a sort of nod to someone saved my life tonight, basically. Right. But also on top of that, he tried a very half-hearted attempt at suicide by leaving all the windows open and taking a pillow and sticking his head in a gas oven on low, to which, I just laughed at. And so
you were in the room when that happened? Basically?
Well, I walked in and what are you doing? You've got a pillow? Would you like me to get you a glass of milk? And then his fiance came in and just like rolled her eyes and walked out. Yeah. So obviously, but the thing is that was an emphasis on showing that he was very confused at the time, Yeah. And so Someone Saved My Life Tonight is basically all of those elements. If you listen to the song, it makes references to those East End lights, those muggy nights, and then it talks about his fiance. And butterflies are free to fly. So there you go.
There we go. Next, we have from Jeremy in West Hills, in your home state now, California. Mm-hmm. Of all the incredible songs you've written, which two are the most meaningful, and why?
Okay, I'm gonna say Sacrifice.
Okay.
And I Want Love.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And
which
you
coming back to,
you talked about I Want Love. Talk about Sacrifice.
Sacrifice is the bookend of your song. Your song was written by a virginal young man who had not experienced romantic heartache of any sort at that point in his life. I mean, just very young, had not tasted bitter fruit. And Sacrifice is that same character, probably 35 years later, who has tasted bitter fruit, and been through the mill and been through relationships and it's about the breakup of a marriage, and but it's a subtle way of putting it. So I always think of the character in both of those songs as the same person.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. This is my own question to follow up on that. Is it how easy or harder is it for you to write lyrics after all these years?
It's very simple. I do it. I mean, if I'm in the mood, and I can pretty much sit down and write something uh, in within an hour. You know, I mean, I'm not as fast as Elton, but I don't belabor the job. I do it. I come back to it. I look at it again. Sometimes I'll change it, things that I don't like the melodic structure of it that's in my head. You know, I feel that I can work it to where it's a little bit more applicable to his part of the job. But no, I the muse is always pretty much front and center. I don't ever remember not being able to write for any particular period of time.
Wow. Now we have Ariane from Mineola, Texas. What was your biggest inspiration as a writer, and how did you get through writer's block?
Well, are we asking about who is my biggest inspiration?
I guess who? Yes, it would be who.
I don't, as a writer myself, I'm not inspired by anybody else in my own writing. There's nobody I say, oh, you know, I want to write a song like that person. I mean, there are endless people that I, you know, respect, literary writers as well as songwriters. You know, I talk about Graham Greene in the book. You know, I mean, he was a huge inspiration to me. And I think a lot of my characters may have come out of characters from his book, because they were all sort of irredeemable and, you know, living on the backside of life, and the grubbier elements in his book that I always loved, his anti-heroes. And I always liked writing about anti-heroes. I mean, sort of Yellow Brick Road is full of them. But and there are so many songwriters that I admire, you know, especially people like Leonard Cohen, who I love, who I cite as being the only songwriter I think you can actually call a poet, because I loathe being referred to as a poet. It's just insult to poets. Good ones, anyway.
We have time for one more question, and we'll go from Austin, from Puyallup, Washington.
I love Austin. I was just there.
Well, his name is Austin.
His name is Austin.
His name is Austin. So.
Wait, is he from Austin?
No, he's from Washington State.
Oh, I like Washington State too.
What was more exciting or intimidating for you, getting on stage at Dodger Stadium in '75 or for the farewell show last year?
That's great. I like that one. That's really fun. No, neither one was intimidating. I did it, and it was fine. I mean, I think people always think I'm I'm sort of shy and retiring and socially inept. And as I say, I've never been Howard Hughes or wanted to be, or Greta Garbo. I didn't want to be alone. No, I like being on my own, and I'm a very solitary guy, but I have no I mean, I don't want to literally. I would hate to have to go on stage and take a bow every night. That would be really boring. And no. But as far as going on, and not intimidated at all. Taking a bow is great, and the crowds are wonderful, and it was beautiful to be appreciated for the last night of the last Dodger Stadium show. I love doing it.
Was that an emotional moment for you?
Not particularly. No, I mean. No. In a word.
In a word. Well, I think we are unfortunately out of time, Bernie. We could keep going for hours, I'm sure. But
I'm losing my voice.
But anyway, it's been great talking to you about it. Congratulations on the publication of Scattershot, which we should.
There you go.
Again, it is there are signed copies available at premiercollectibles.com/scattershot. And best of luck with the launch. And thanks everybody for sending in some great
thanks everybody.
questions.
And I'm sure we would have liked to get to everybody's questions, but
we got to enough of them. Time as it goes. So goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Is that how we sign off? How do you?
Goodbye, and see you all later.
Yeah.
Hey, this is John Acuff, New York Times best-selling author of 7 books and someone who's done a live signing. If you like the one you just watched, make sure you check out our YouTube channel. It's full of amazing authors having great conversations and signing books for viewers